Hi, I'm Sarah Schatz, and you're listening to Kindle Curiosity, a podcast for curious souls where we explore the creative process. This podcast is powered by the Kindle community on Patreon to keep things advert-free. Take a seat by the fire, and let's welcome today's guest. So today's guest is very, very special. I've been following Andrea on Instagram for a couple of years now, and she's an editor at American Girl magazine, which is pretty cool. So when she announced that she had a book coming out, I had to invite her on the podcast. But what I didn't know is that her book is published through American Girl. So I started getting all of these emails from the American Girl PR department, and everything became very surreal for me. Growing up, I was obsessed with American Girl. I know I have a pretty international audience, so for any of you that aren't familiar, American Girl books are kind of that jump between picture books and chapter books when you first start reading by yourself. And I read them all around the first grade. There were also dolls that went with each of the books. I had Felicity, who was set in the 1700s, which started some of my obsession with tea, and she rode horses, and she was just really, they were all really heroic and brave and powerful girls. In addition to the historical books, they also have nonfiction books about creativity and entrepreneurship and growing up and taking care of yourself. I had a lot of those too. And there was also a magazine, which was the only magazine I ever subscribed to growing up. And it had a lot of crafts and projects and was just really inspiring. It was very much along the lines of Girl Scouts and Girl Guides, female empowerment and all of that kind of thing. So I was so excited when I connected with Andrea through her photography on Instagram, and I clicked over to her bio and saw she was an editor at American Girl magazine. I'm like, I think you ended up with the coolest job ever. So her book is all about creativity, and we're going to talk a lot about that. I'll do her proper introduction in a minute, but I just wanted to give a little bit of background to American Girl, and I wanted to let you know that I'm running a giveaway for Andrea's book on Instagram. So if you are listening to this before September 2nd, you still have a chance to enter that. My Instagram is at Sarah D. Schatz, or you can find the link in the show notes at kindlecuriosity.com. So let's get to it. Andrea Debbink is editor at American Girl magazine and author of Spark, a guide to ignite the creativity inside you. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited.
Me too.
So I like to start with what kindled your curiosity growing up.
For me, probably the biggest thing would be books. I've always been a huge reader, and just from a really young age, reading was always a part of my childhood and our family life. Both my parents are very big readers and were back then. So I did a lot of reading on my own at a young age, but we also did a lot of reading out loud. So it was actually at a pretty young age that I decided that I wanted to be a writer someday, just because I was so in love with books and just the idea that you could create these worlds just with words on paper. So that was definitely one of the major things for me. I also have always loved nature and the outdoors. And I grew up in the suburbs of Minneapolis, so there wasn't a ton of nature where I lived. But I do just remember spending a lot of time outside as a kid, especially in the summer, getting up in the morning, spending time outside with my friends, maybe coming in for lunch, then going out again until it was dark outside. I had kind of one of those childhoods. And I was just always really fascinated by nature and the things that I found outside. So I think those are two of the bigger things. I think a third thing that definitely kindled my curiosity as a kid was history. It's kind of interesting because all three of these themes still, present themselves in my life today. But I just always loved history. And I'm not really sure where that came from, other than the fact that my mom really loved history. I read historical fiction when I was a kid. I loved kind of researching different historical periods on my own. And I think part of my love of history probably came from my love of story. I loved reading about other people's experiences and other times and places. So yeah, all those things that I was into as a kid have really followed me into adulthood too.
Yeah, I love history. I think for the same reason, because I always read a lot of stories and books about olden times.
Yep.
And my husband thinks he hates history. And I think that's because the way he was taught, it was all about dates
Yeah.
and memorization. And I'm like, well, that's not fun. You
Right.
have to get down into it.
Yeah, you definitely do. And it's funny that you mentioned that about dates because I actually, one of my majors in school was history, but I am actually pretty bad with dates. So if people think that because I have this degree in history that I know that sort of thing. And I often don't. And that's kind of embarrassing. But yeah, I'm really more interested in the story of history than just like the dates and
Right. That's
names.
the important stuff,
It
right?
is. Yeah.
The other's just numbers. So let's talk about how that led to what you do now.
Yeah. Well, let's see. So I always knew I wanted to be a writer, but the type of writer kind of changed over time. When I was a kid, I wanted to write kids' books because those are the only books I knew at the time. And then as I got older, I learned about the word journalism. And I thought, well, maybe I'll be a journalist. And when I was in high school, I wrote for my school newspaper. And it was around that time that I decided that I wanted to major in journalism. So when I went to college, I majored in journalism and history. And because I'd always liked magazines, I thought that I would go into that specific type of journalism. So when I was in school studying journalism is when I got my first internship. And it was actually at American Girl magazine where I work now. I really needed an internship as a part of my degree. And I was going to school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And American Girl's headquarters are actually based just outside of Madison in Middleton, Wisconsin. And it was actually my dad who suggested that I get in touch with them and see if they need an intern, which is not something that I wanted to do at all, because I just don't do that sort of thing, even then. And he finally, was just like, just write them a letter, ask if they need an intern. The worst they can do is say no. And so finally I gave in and I wrote them a letter, and they ended up writing back and called me in for an interview and got me started as an intern. And I think I was probably the first one they had at that time.
Were they looking for an intern, or was that kind of prompted by you asking?
Yeah, it was prompted by me asking, as far as I understand. It was one of those things where they almost didn't know what to do with me when I started because I hadn't, wasn't stepping into a role that already existed or anything. And I did a lot of random things. I remember one of the first things that I did was I researched cat breeds to see which cat breed would be photogenic for the cover.
Okay.
And I remember thinking at the time, like, this is so important. I have to get this right, because it was like the first thing I did for the magazine. But also I would read a lot of reader mail because we've always gotten a lot of letters from girls.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved that because it was just such great insight into what readers were thinking and just kind of gave a lot of purpose to what we were doing at the magazine. And then I want to say I was there for 3 years. And after that, I kind of entered this period of life post-college where I was questioning, well, what do I really want to do? Part of me was kind of worried because I'd been pursuing this writing and editing thing for so long that maybe that was just a default. Maybe I really didn't want that anymore. So I kind of spent my early 20s, working at Starbucks, kind of doing random things as I tried to figure that out. And then eventually, this was about 9 years ago, a job opening happened at American Girl magazine, and I saw it and I thought, okay. And I applied and I ended up getting the job. And actually, just before my time doing that, I had been an assistant editor at another magazine that was here in town. It was a statewide magazine that was kind of more about travel in our state, but that folded. So I left that magazine, and then about 9 years ago, ended up at American Girl. And I've been there ever since. For the most of that time, I've been working mainly on the magazine. But within the past 2 years, I've also transitioned to editing books and writing books as well. So it's been kind of a long path, but it's just been kind of interesting for me to look back and see how so many things have ultimately come together, So yeah, that's how I got where I am now.
That's something I noticed when I was looking at your website, that you talk about the changes that are happening in journalism and have been happening in journalism.
Yeah.
I guess you get to see that from the inside a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I know when I was even in college, so I graduated from college in 2005. So just prior to that is when digital media really started growing a lot. Blogs were first, being published for the first time. People didn't really know what they were. I remember learning about blogs in a journalism class that I was taking, and had like notes about what a blog was and everything. And I do remember at the time, a couple of professors of mine telling me that magazine wasn't a good thing to go into because of all the changes that were happening. But I kind of didn't really care because I loved magazines and I wanted the opportunity to work on one if I could. So I mean, it's been interesting to kind of see the changes from, print to digital to back again in some cases, but still at the same time kind of exciting to be a part of.
Yeah. So what does it mean to be an editor of a magazine?
It's funny because I feel like that term can be different depending on the publication that you're working for. So technically my title at the magazine is lifestyle editor. That's the job that I was initially hired for. And that means I have kind of ownership over certain parts of the magazine. And for me, that's always been the craft content, the cooking, any sort of content that has to do with creative expression. Sometimes I write quizzes, that sort of thing. So at American Girl, we actually don't hire a lot of freelancers to do our features. So most of that content that I'm in charge of is content that I write. So I'll develop and write the cooking features, develop and write the craft features, or any other articles that appear in my sections. And then I'll also edit those sections too. So it's like, you're writing and then you're editing. But the good thing is because we work on a team, there'll be another editor
Right.
who will also edit the first draft or so of my pieces. And then we also have a copy editor on staff who thankfully probably sees our features like 3 times before they go to press, which is really good because I feel like my copy editing skills have gotten a bit sloppy after being more of a developmental editor. So yeah, I mean, in my job, my duties range in everything from writing to the actual editing to styling at photo shoots, especially with the craft features that I do. I actually have to make the crafts that we end up shooting and then go to the photo shoots and be a part of that process. When it comes to food, sometimes we'll do the food styling, but food styling really isn't my strength. And we have some great freelance food stylists that we use. And then in that case, I'm just more working with them, making sure that they get the information that they need, and that I'm there on set, kind of making sure that what we're doing in the photo matches what I've written in the feature itself. So in my job, it tends to encompass a lot more than just making sure commas are in the right place.
Right. Yeah. I wanted to ask about that because I could tell from a brief glance at your website that it wasn't just editing what someone else made.
Right.
Is that common or is that unique to the American Girl magazine, or is everything in such flux right now that you don't know what you're going to get?
I think that's a good question. I do think it's kind of unique to the type of magazine that we're working on because at the magazine where I worked at before, I was assistant editor, and there was a bigger, bolder line between editorial and design. Mm-hmm. For instance, when I would write articles for that magazine, I would, write something in a Word document and then hand it off to the art directors. They'd design it. I wouldn't see it again till the end, when I was like reviewing the proofs before it went to press. But at American Girl, and I think part of this is because it's a kids magazine. Kids magazines are so visually driven. There's just a lot of collaboration that happens between the verbal visual and the editor design side of things. So I think it's a little unique to American Girl, but maybe just unique to children's media in general because they're so visually driven.
Yeah, I know you guys sent me a copy of a new American Girl magazine along with your book.
Yeah.
And I flipped through that yesterday, and it seems like there's a lot more illustration and art in it than I remember. Mm-hmm. I remember a lot more photography in the ones back in the 90s.
Yeah, we do have a lot of amazing illustrators. And I think part of that, and this is just based on some things that I read, I've heard that children's illustration specifically is kind of like going through this renaissance period right now. I mean, there's just so many amazing illustrators out there that we've just started to use them more and more in the magazine. And there's just so many different unique styles and different, feeling that they can give to each of the features. So we still try to do photography when we can get like real girls in the magazine because it's important to us to show like the real girls who are reading the magazine, who are featuring. But yeah, we love experimenting and using different types of illustrations too.
Yeah, it was fun to see some things that seemed new and then some things that were the same, like exactly the same, where you write in and it would say, reckless or, the dear help letters. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always been one of the most popular sections of the magazine.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like every generation of girls has like needed that.
I feel like I was flipping through and I was like, something's missing. Like, where? And then I got to the end and it was at the very end. And I was like, oh, yeah, I remember this.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's always been at the very end of the magazine.
I must have forgotten that. And then one part I really liked was, I don't know what it's called, but you do. So the one where it talks about a girl and who she grew up to be.
Oh, yeah. That's Who's That Girl? That's actually a feature that I write. So that makes me happy to hear you say that. But I don't know if you remember back in the 90s, but Who's That Girl was a department back then when I read the magazine as a subscriber. And at the time, it was a feature where usually they'd take a woman who was like still alive today. Like I remember they did Lisa Frank back when I was a kid, and I totally freaked out because I loved Lisa Frank. And it was like you said, it was a little more photography driven. Like you'd have pictures of the person from when she was a kid, then you turn the page, and here she is as an adult.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
guess it just looks so different
It
now.
does. And that was kind of intentional. It was actually my idea to bring that back about a year and a half ago. I approached my boss and said, this was always my favorite feature in the magazine when I was a kid, and especially because it has that history angle. So, she totally was up for bringing it back, but we wanted to think about it in a different way, especially because I wanted to expand it to not just women who are still alive today, but women from throughout history. And I knew that would be a much bigger challenge to get the photography or any
Right.
photography. One of the women we've done just this past year, Maria Marion, she's from the 1600s, so it's like, well, I suppose you could do like paintings, but it just kind of gives us a little more creative freedom. But yeah, that's probably my favorite feature in the whole magazine to write right now, just because I love that history.
Yeah, it definitely stood out to me when I was reading. So, before we start talking about your book,
Mhm.
how does the process work where you're planning an issue?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're always working about 6 months ahead of the current season. So like right now, I'm starting to write my features for January 2019, which is like kind of hard to get into that headspace right now because it's 90 degrees today. But usually what happens, so I'd say maybe 8 months out before the issue, we'll have a meeting that we just call book map planning, where we fill in the magazine for the issue that's about 8 months out. And at that meeting, it's all of the magazine staff. So it's the editors, my boss, who's the executive editor, and then our designers, art directors who work on the staff. And everybody brings their ideas to this meeting. They can really, anybody can bring anything. Like if, an art director has an idea for a craft, that's cool. Like the ideas kind of come from anywhere. We sit down, we present them to each other, and then we just kind of decide collectively, obviously with my boss's input, since she's in charge, what goes where, and if we're going to maybe use that in this issue or save it for a later issue or tweak it a little bit. So it's very collaborative, which I really love, because I think everybody on our team has different strengths, and we really kind of help play to each other's strengths and support each other. And then from there, probably a month or so after that, my boss will actually make assignments and decide, okay, this editor is doing this. And then shortly after that, the art directors get assigned to their different pages. And then I'm kind of free to run with it from there. So then 6 months before the issue kicks off, or 6 months before the issue is published, we'll have what we call kickoff. And that's when you come with your assigned pieces and then your plans for those pieces. So if at our planning session meeting, we had decided that, okay, we're going to do a pretzel recipe for the holiday issue, I would get that idea and then I'd come to the kickoff meeting with my plans for what that would be.
Mm-hmm.
And, I can just kind of talk through the ideas, and that can be as detailed or as general as the editor wants at that point. And there's always input, throughout the process too. I get feedback on the stuff I write. I get feedback from the art director. So it's a lot of back and forth and collaborating throughout the whole
Yeah.
process.
It's really interesting because growing up, I always had a really strong idea that authors wrote books, but I never thought about who made a magazine.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny because even with books, and this is one thing I found with the book that I just wrote, is, it really takes a big group of people to make a book happen. I always thought too, like, oh, it's the author doing the work, but like, I don't know, without the team of people that were a part of creating my book, it would still be a Word document right now. There's just so many other skills that go into making a book happen.
Yeah, so I want to hear about that, but before we get into the process,
Mhm.
for anyone who hasn't read your book yet, if you can tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so it's a middle grade nonfiction book. So I wrote it for preteens, and it's called Spark, A Guide to Ignite the Creativity Inside You. And basically, it's a guidebook to creativity. The beginning of the book talks about what creativity is and kind of helps cast this broad vision for what creativity is. And then the rest of the book basically takes the reader through 4 stages of creativity, kind of this outline of the creative process. The 4 stages that are outlined in the book are imagine, make, tinker, and finish. And those are just stages that I came up with kind of based on my own creative process, the creative process I've heard about from other people. And it's just kind of a different way of thinking about the act of making something, whether it's writing a book or a painting or woodworking or any type of creativity. And it's really meant to help, like I said, expand the reader's definition of what it means to be creative. Because I know I definitely grew up with this mindset that, creative people are artistic people. And if you're not artistic, then you're not creative. Or if you're not good at painting,
right,
you're not creative. Or, if you like math, you're not creative. It was kind of like creativity often becomes this very small box in the way that we define it. So my goal was really to help these young readers understand that there are so many different ways to be creative. And really being creative is more about finding the ways that you like to express yourself. And that can be so many different things depending on who you are.
I loved that it started that way. That was one of the notes I had down to talk about today, because I think that's something we're really exploring with this podcast too, is that creativity doesn't have to be drawing and painting.
Right.
And I love how that came up throughout the book, all the different ways that you can be creative.
Yeah.
And it's an American Girl book, but I think adults could get so much out of reading this too.
Yeah.
I know I resonated on such a high frequency with every page. I was like, yes, the way that you describe things is so clear. I have people come to me sometimes with their creative frustrations, and I'm just going to point them to certain pages in your book.
That's awesome.
Another part that I really loved was the section on the different creative women.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Many of whom I've never even heard of, so I'm going to go down all these research rabbit holes now.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's what that's meant to do.
So how did you come up with that group?
That group of women? Well, unfortunately, I was restricted in my page count for that section. I could have, written a whole book with these women because
of course
there's just so many that you could name. I think initially, my goal with that section was, again, to really cast this broad net of what it means to be creative and what are different ways that you can be creative in your life. So I was really careful when I was brainstorming my initial list of women to include that I would represent a kind of a broader range of disciplines, but then also made sure that I was pulling from different parts of history, different cultural groups, and just kind of to make sure that whoever's reading the book, hopefully they can find somebody in that group of people that they can identify with in some way so that they can see themselves in these women. So I actually had a much longer list initially. And unfortunately, a book can only be so many pages, and there had to be other things in this book. But that was, one of my favorite sections to work on, because I found as I was researching these women myself, I just was so inspired, by each of these women's stories and kind of what they went through and their creative process. And yeah, I definitely need to check out some biographies now, just based on the research that I did for these pages.
Just to give people an idea of the range, we have astronaut, chef, costume designer, inventor, architect, scientific illustrator, athlete, musician, astronomer. Yeah, so I'm definitely going to dig into this. So excited.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So the spark for the book, the idea, how did that come about?
It's funny. I've been working on this for so long. It's sometimes hard for me to kind of unravel that and get back to that original, how this all happened. So I originally came up with this idea back in 2016, and we kind of did what we do every year. The editors kind of get together and brainstorm their ideas for the books that we want to publish. And then we pass those off to, the executive editor and then other people within the company. And I pitched book ideas before, but this was really kind of unique because we'd never done a book like this before. We have a section of our publishing division that's devoted to nonfiction. We call it advice and activity. And that's where you find our craft books, our quiz books, Care and Keeping of You, Smart Girls Guides. Those are all books that fall under that heading. We've done craft books before, but never a book that was just on creativity in general. And I think I had been reading a lot about creativity just as a topic of study in my own life as a person who loves creativity and doing creative things. And I had read, I want to say it was Big Magic around that time. Steal Like an Artist was probably another one I was reading. There are a lot of books out there for adults about creativity. And I think there are even more now. That's kind of become a pretty big area. But I hadn't seen anything like that for kids, or specifically for this audience, for this preteen audience. And it just really got me thinking, preteens need to hear this too. kids need to hear this too. I think we often think of kids as being, oh, they're just naturally creative and exploratory and they're so much freer than adults. And sometimes that's true. But I also think that kids come up against the same barriers that adults do when it comes to creativity, whether that's, lack of confidence or just not knowing where to start, maybe not having the skills. And I actually heard a really great podcast that I'd recommend on Elizabeth Gilbert's Magic Lessons. It's her podcast that she did as a result of Big Magic. And she was doing an interview with Brene Brown about creativity. And they were talking about what they called art scars. This idea that so many people who are adults who don't think they're creative or have stopped pursuing creative things reach that point because they were discouraged as children, because they had that snuffed out in them at a young age. And it just really got me thinking, as a person who writes for children, what can I give them? What can I write that would help make them resilient, in the face of that would help them instead of, giving up their creative pursuits at age 10 and then not picking it up again until they're 60. What can I give them and tell them now that they can use throughout their life to kind of continue to cultivate those skills? So that's why the book itself, it talks about things like the inner critic, talks about things like criticism and discouragement and all these things that adults face, but I think kids face them too. So that's kind of where that idea came from. But then along with that, just working at the magazine, we get a lot of letters from girls about all kinds of things. But I had been seeing some themes in the letters that we were getting from girls on the topic of creativity. A girl would write in and say, I really want to be a writer, but I have no idea what to write. What can I write? And they'd ask us, because I didn't know. And then, another letter might say something like, I really want to be an artist, but everything I draw is really bad. What do I do? And I just felt like I really had those questions in my head as I was writing this book, like, okay, kids are asking these questions. What's the answer? What can I give them to go on?
Yeah.
So for that second question about, everything I draw is bad, but I want to be an artist, what do I do? Really that helped motivate my chapter on prototypes, and the importance of, you got to create a lot of stuff that you might consider bad or, just not up to the skill level that you want in order to get to the stuff that you actually are satisfied with.
Yeah, that was another point I had written down. I feel like, yes, that's really important for kids, but also as an adult, sometimes we think we should already be good at a thing.
Yes.
And if you're learning something new, you have to start at that point.
Yes.
You have to make a lot of not so great things before you can make the great thing. So I think that's such a great lesson no matter what age you are. But especially that preteen age, I feel like is where you start to meet your inner critic.
Yes.
I don't know if that was personal to me, but it's kind of like when you're very little, you are kind of free with your creativity. And then the outside forces start to come in and be like, if you're going to write, it has to be good enough to publish.
Yep.
Or why are you going to waste your time in art class? You can't be a professional artist.
Right.
And so I think this is really great to be out there in the world.
Thank you.
So let's go back to another thing. I love that the things you're mentioning are the things I had written down, but let's go a little bit deeper into the criticism versus critique, because I thought that was a really good distinction.
So yeah, I think, like I had kind of said in the book, in our culture today, we're a culture that's full of feedback, like everything has a rating, whether it's the book we read or the movie we watched, but also like the spatula you buy on Amazon.
That's true.
And I have to admit, I'm a big reader of ratings, and I read those before I buy things. But I think the unfortunate thing is that filters over into other areas where a rating system isn't all that helpful. And that comes into play with our creative work. So I really wanted to be careful when I was writing this section of the book to talk about, like, okay, criticism and critique are two different things. Criticism is unhelpful. It's hurtful. It's something that you shouldn't really pay attention to. But then critique, you don't want to disregard all feedback, right? Because feedback is what makes our creative ideas stronger. So I wanted to make sure that I also left room for feedback, for critique. So that's why in the book, I walked through this section where I'm describing, like, what is creative critique? How do you do it? How do you invite others, into your thing that you're doing? Because I think you can kind of fall into the error of, well, it doesn't really matter what anyone says. I'm just going to create this, no matter what people say. And if you want to create that way, that's fine. But I don't think you become better at what you do that way.
Right.
I think that's one thing that I've learned in writing is it's really scary still for me to give my rough drafts to people and let them read it. But it's so important that I find those people who will give me honest feedback and constructive feedback about my work, because that just makes it better in the end and makes it stronger and helps refine those ideas. So I thought, kids are not too young to understand that because they're already facing those pressures.
Yeah, for sure. I remember giving a story that I wrote to someone probably around like 11, and they fixated on this one detail, like a copy editing thing. Oh. And I'm like, is that all you have to say? That's what you took away from this?
Oh, yeah.
So I like how your book encouraged girls to find people who they trusted that would give a helpful critique instead of just criticism, because that's definitely something you learn early.
Yep. And something that, especially if kids are on social media, when you post things out there, share them with the world that way, you kind of get this indiscriminate audience of likes and comments. And I think it's a lot better to find the people who are going to help you in your work and care about what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. So this is probably a good transition into the process of how it went from idea and that team of people that you worked with. I'm really curious because the book isn't just blocks of text.
Yeah.
There's quizzes and there's bubbles to write in, and kind of how it became that.
Well, the first step in writing the book for me, I had to kind of kick off that process. I had to give my boss, who's the executive editor and the head of the nonfiction books, I had to give her an outline of the book, because I had already, when I pitched the original book idea, had kind of a working title, which actually wasn't this one, had a working title and then kind of this brief synopsis of this is what it's going to be. We kind of knew how many pages it would be at that point. So then I had to develop an outline of this idea, give it to her for her approval. And for me, that really started with a stack of Post-it notes. I remember coming home one of the days when I was first working on it, and I had all these ideas and they were all so random. And I'm not a person who believes that you sit down and just write chronologically through a manuscript or a piece of writing. I really think you kind of need to collect all the ideas, and then I like to put them in order. So I just had a stack of Post-it notes, and as ideas came to me, topics I wanted included, ideas that I had even for like a quiz or whatever, I would just write it down on the Post-it note. And then I would put it up on a bulletin board and kind of move it around. As I saw themes, I would group things together or, take ideas off if I was being redundant. And then it was really from that I was able to create my outline, kind of a higher level outline, not as detailed. And then once I got my boss to sign off on that, then I could actually start writing the manuscript. And it's tricky actually writing a book like this that's so visual, because it takes a while before you see it taking the shape it's supposed to take, So when I started writing the book, it was just a Word document. And I had to really kind of imagine how these words are going to fit within a space, and maybe how much work the illustrations would do to help communicate what I'm trying to say. And fortunately, because I've worked in magazine for so long, I already kind of think visually that way when I'm writing, and I'm able to picture, okay, how might this look on the page? What type of illustration might accompany this? And then once I had that initial manuscript finished, then I would get together with the art director of the book, whose name is Dan. And then it was really a collaborative process between the two of us. Like, okay, here's the manuscript. How do we divide this up onto pages? What types of illustrations should accompany these things? And then the art director really is kind of, I consider them the architect of the book, because now they take all this information in this manuscript form and they start kind of blocking it out within a book. And then they're also the person that works directly with the illustrator. So ultimately, this book was kind of a small team of me, Dan, the art director, Emily, the illustrator, working together kind of over time. And it takes a long time, but I want to say a few months after I wrote the manuscript is when I started seeing the book actually in its layout. So with illustrations, and that's really when it started to come together in a really real way. That's the most exciting part for me, because as a Word document, this book is very boring. But once you get the visual parts in it, it just really came alive.
So how long was it for that whole process?
I started writing the manuscript probably in March of 2017, and the illustrator was working on it over the course of that summer. I think we finally handed it off to the printer that fall. So it was like
About a year-ish.
Yeah. And then of course we send it out and it's just gone and we don't see it for a long time just because of our long, printing process and everything. So
Yeah.
it's really weird. It's been out of my hands for a very long time, but yet not on the shelf yet. So
Yeah.
it's like this weird limbo that you're in after that happens.
So before we kind of leave the discussion of the book and go to something else, is there anything else you want to talk about?
Just like to go back to just the idea that books are about more than just the writer or the author. Like I said, there were so many people that were a part of this book. I mean, there was the art director, Dan, Emily, the illustrator, me, who wrote it. But then, there are people involved in sourcing like the paper stock and the cover stock. There are people in production. There are other designers who are prepping the files for printing. There's people who are weighing in throughout the editing process. And then even just, the marketers and people in PR. There are so many people involved in this process. And because it's my first book, it was just really eye-opening to me to just realize how many hands touch this project before it actually gets into the hands of the reader. And that experience just really left me with an appreciation for all of those people and just all the different parts that definitely as a reader of books, you never see. And you probably don't think about. I know I never did until I was doing this. Yeah, it takes a village definitely to create a book. And it's a great collaborative experience.
So let's kind of go back a little bit to when you were reading American Girl. Did you have a favorite?
Oh, absolutely. Kirsten Larson was my favorite because when I started reading the American Girl books, there were only 3 historical characters at the time, and they hadn't done any contemporary characters at all. So it was Samantha, Molly, and Kirsten. And I really liked Kirsten specifically because I was really into pioneers at the time. I loved the idea of being a pioneer. And then also she was a Swedish immigrant to Minnesota, and my ancestors were Scandinavian immigrants to Minnesota. So I felt like there was this connection. I could kind of understand my ancestors a little bit better because of reading her story. And then she was the only doll that I got as a kid too. I begged for 2 years. And finally I got her for Christmas one year, I think when I was 9.
Yeah, I only have one too. I have Felicity.
Oh, she was my second favorite. I was going to get her next and I got another one.
Yeah, it's the red hair.
Yeah.
She's so spunky.
Yeah. And her horse. I mean, I loved horses at the time. So
yeah, I'm allergic to hay, but I still went to do the horse thing at Girl Scout camp.
Oh, because you can't stay away from horses.
Yeah, you just have to, drug yourself.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm actually very allergic either to hay or horses now because I took riding lessons as a kid, but now I can't get close to a horse. Otherwise it's just lots of Benadryl for me.
Yeah, lots of Benadryl for sure. So how does curiosity play a part in your creative process?
I think I'm a natural researcher. So curiosity and research kind of go together. For me, curiosity is what drives my research. And then I also tend to just, once I start researching something, whether it's an idea or a person or something, I just tend to go down lots and lots of rabbit holes and discover new things along the way. But yeah, I think for me, curiosity is what drives my research in the first place. And also just my desire to learn. I just love to learn and teach myself new skills. So for me, it's pretty much the fuel to what I do.
Yeah, me too. Oh, I love a good research project.
Me too. I never did in school, but I do now. I don't know why that is.
Well, it's because you get to pick. It's something that sparked you instead of something that's come down upon you.
Yeah.
So what else fascinates you?
Definitely something that fascinates me, and this has come a little bit later now in my life, is travel. I never would have considered myself a big travel lover before, but I left the country for the first time when I was, I think, 21. I went to China, and that was amazing. And since then, I've been to 3 other countries. And most recently, we traveled to England and Wales a couple of years ago. And I just feel like anytime I go on a trip, it doesn't have to be internationally, but those are kind of the bigger ones. Travel just really inspires me. I feel more creative afterwards. I feel more open while I am traveling. It's just kind of interesting. I think I often go on trips thinking that I'm going to be really creative on the trip. So I'll bring a lot of books to read and my journal and colored pencils. And I just think I'm going to be so creative while I'm there. And this totally happened when we went to England because I was like, okay, England, the source of such great literature. And I'm going to go to all these writers' houses and all these places. I'm going to be so inspired. I'm just going to want to write. And of course, when I'm there, it's well, no, I just want to be here.
Right. Yeah.
And I find that, travel for me is more about just the soaking up the experience and taking in all the inspiration. And then when I get home, it's okay, now I'm refreshed. now I've, have some ideas to run with.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I had the same. We went on a trip last April to England, and I had went to university there, so I was showing my husband, like my favorite haunts.
Yeah.
And I just had in my mind, because I'd seen people doing these travel journals, that this would be the thing that I would do, and I would go and I would paint, and I think I might have done like 2 pages when we were newly there. And then, like you said, you just kind of want to be there. I mean, I took photos and video, but yeah, it's something about you just kind of want to soak it up.
Yep.
And maybe it's a personality thing, like some people are sponges and some people want to paint while they're actually in the place.
Yeah.
For me, I was definitely more, even now, I'm still kind of processing some of the thoughts and ideas that I soaked up then. Our garden especially is inspired by Beatrix Potter's home, Hilltop, and
oh, that's so cool.
Oh, what's her name? Anne Hathaway's cottage on Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's wife. So I'm trying to build an English cottage garden and have that whole like travel, like take pieces of what was there and have them here. And also a little bit inspired by Lucy Maud Montgomery and some of the flowers in Anne of Green Gables.
That's a really cool idea.
And it's like it didn't come right away. It's interesting to see how those inspirations like plant themselves in your mind and then they sprout out.
Yeah. I'm jealous that you got to go to Stratford because I went to Stratford, but I didn't get to actually see Stratford because we were running late for the play that we were going to see there. And so it was like we got in, saw the play, and then it was like, 11 o'clock at night and we drove back. So
I know I was there for a whole year when I was studying for my master's, and there's still places I didn't see, most especially places that were really close, because I always thought, I can just go there one afternoon, like that'll be easy.
Right.
And then I didn't go at all. And there's so much, especially being in London, but yeah, definitely you have to go back because there's so much there. So also I noticed, I think it might have been in the magazine, that you have climbed a mountain.
Oh, yes, I have. A few. Yeah, that was probably in our most recent issue in the masthead, right? Yeah. When was the last one that I climbed? It was last summer. Yeah, I want to say back in the summer of 2003, it was one of the first times I went to Colorado and climbed what they call 14ers. 14er is a mountain that's over 14,000 feet. And in Colorado, it's the highest mountains that they have, are over 14,000 feet. And people kind of make like this bucket list of climbing them often. There's 54 of them in Colorado. So back in that summer, I think I might have climbed 3 that summer. And I thought I had this grand idea like, I'll do all 54, but that's probably not going to happen now because some of them are actually very technical and you shouldn't just like approach them like you think you can just hike up them. But I think I've actually hiked 10 to 12 of them now. And the most recent one, my husband and I did together last September. It was Castle Peak near Aspen. I wouldn't recommend it, actually. we hiked it. We got back down okay, but it was actually the scariest experience I've ever had in a mountain. And part of that is that we had a guidebook and we had read online and everything telling us that it was a class 2, which is something we've done before. So we thought, okay, this route is the same type of route we've done on other mountains, except it wasn't really a class 2. It ended up being a lot harder and kind of lost the path at one point on the way back down. So it was really intense. I'm glad that I did it. But yeah, I do really enjoy hiking 14ers because it's like a really intense hike most of the time. And there's just such an incredible feeling of being on the summit of one of those peaks. I mean, to be on the tallest thing all around you is a pretty cool experience. And it feels like an accomplishment, especially for someone like me who not really an athlete. So to be able to do something like that, that's actually a physical challenge, feels like a big accomplishment to me.
So is that something you do in like a day, or do you camp on the way up?
For the ones that we've done, you can hike them all within a day. So sometimes it's a long day. So you'll get up, usually you try to get up early anyway, because the weather tends to turn very quickly in the mountains, and it's best to be hiking in the morning often because then they have thunderstorms in the afternoon. But yeah, all the hikes we've done have been just day hikes.
So you said you wouldn't recommend that mountain. Which mountain would you recommend?
Maybe Mount Democrat. I have to keep them all straight now. I believe it's near Breckenridge in Colorado, and it is supposed to be an easier hike, on the easier end. And of course, easy is a relative term.
Yeah.
But when you climb Democrat, you can also climb, I think it's Cameron, so that you can climb more than one. Like if you do one and you feel like, I can do another, you kind of hike down the saddle and go up to another summit. And it wasn't particularly crowded when we did it. Oftentimes, depending on the peaks, they can be very, very crowded. which if you like that sort of thing, that's fine. But if you don't want to feel like you're at Disney World while you're on a hike, that's, you might not like that. So yeah, I mean, but they're all beautiful. Quandary, which is also near Breckenridge, is also a really beautiful mountain. And we climbed that in November, which is not really the greatest time because then you're dealing with snow sometimes, which we were. Summer's really the best time in late summer because then all the snow is melted from the previous season, but then you haven't gotten it for the new season yet.
I've never been up to that area, so
it's beautiful.
Have to put that on our travel list.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite parts of the country. I would possibly live there, but I'm pretty tied to the Midwest. But yeah, for me, coming from a place that's relatively flat, the first time I went out to Colorado, it was just amazing to be there with all the mountains.
So writers love to read. What are you reading right now?
This is a good question because I'm actually reading 2 books I really like right now. Sometimes when you get that question, you're reading a book that you're not that crazy about. I'm reading a book called I Was Anastasia, and I can't remember the author's name, and the book's not here, but it's a historical fiction, and it's exploring the story of Anna Anderson, who was a woman who claimed to be Princess Anastasia of the Russian royal family that was executed in 1918. And, after their execution, there were kind of these myths and rumors that persisted for years that Anastasia survived. And I guess there were many people over the years that claimed to be her. But this novel is kind of exploring the story of one particular woman who claimed to be her. And it's presupposing that she is her. So it's kind of filling in the backstory of, okay, wait a second, how did this woman, Anna Anderson, how is she Anastasia? How did that connection happen? So I really like it because it time travels a bit between, 1918 up to the 1970s, then back to the 1940s. And there's kind of this mystery element to it that I really like. And then I'm usually reading 2 books at a time. I usually have like a physical book that I'm reading and then an audiobook that I'm listening to because I like to listen to audiobooks on my commute. And the audiobook that I just started is Daring Greatly by Brene Brown.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I just love her. And this book, this is not one of her newer books. I think it's been out for about 10 years, but she just came out with the audiobook version that has her reading it. So I just started that and I'm really liking it a lot so far.
I've just recently read Braving the Wilderness.
Yeah.
And it's like your book, like some books you read and you're like, yes, this makes so much sense. And now I'm wanting to go back and read her older books, but I think I looked for that one on Audible and it wasn't there yet. So I will have to go put that on my list for sure.
Yeah.
So usually people are asked how to become a professional at what they do, but if someone just wanted to dabble in writing, where would you suggest that they start?
I would say maybe before you even sit down at a computer to think about the type of writing that you enjoy. So if you're a reader, what types of books do you enjoy reading? What types of writing are you drawn to? Because I think there's this idea that, well, if you're a writer, you're good at writing everything. And that is not true for me at all. And it's kind of a quote unquote burden that I've carried because I am a writer and I've been pursuing it for a while. I've often run into people throughout my life that think that I should be good at writing all types of things, and I'm not. And so I think if it's something you want to dabble in, to really think about, well, what type of writing do you want to write? Do you want to write fiction? Do you want to write memoir? Do you want to write instructive kind of nonfiction sorts of things? Do you just want to spill on the page and, not really have a set agenda? And so I think that's the important thing to realize first is that, you could really pick any type of writing that you want and then just start writing and make it a habit. I think when you make writing a regular habit, it puts less pressure on each time you sit down at the computer. And that's one thing that I've learned myself, that writing really is a muscle. And if you treat writing like it's this special event, like, oh, I used to have this mentality towards writing, like, okay, I'm going to clear this afternoon and I'm going to go to this coffee shop and I'm going to sit down and I just have to write something amazing. Like, writing rarely happens that way. For me, I'm a lot more productive and feel a lot better about the process when I just make it a regular, normal thing in my life. I tend to do these things that I like to call writing sprints, where I'll say, okay, I'm going to sit down for half an hour and I'm just going to write about this topic or write towards this project, and then I'm done. And it just kind of takes the pressure off it because it's more about just sitting down and working that writing muscle than it is about like producing something really beautiful. So yeah, I guess my second piece of advice there would be to treat writing just like a normal practice and know that it doesn't have to look a certain way or be this special event in your life. I often will write on my phone. Like if I'm somewhere where I don't have a notebook or my laptop or whatever, I'll get an idea. I'll just like write in the notes section on my phone if I'm like waiting in the line at the grocery store or whatever. Like it doesn't have to be this like experience in an office or something. Like it can happen anywhere. So yeah, those are probably the 2 biggest pieces of advice I would have about that.
That's great. Do you have another project you're working on right now?
Yeah, I mean, I always have personal projects I'm writing, and whether or not they're going somewhere, it's hard to say. I probably, outside of the work that I do for American Girl, I probably have like 3 book ideas that are always kind of on the back burner in my mind. And a couple of those ideas, I just don't feel I'm quite ready to fully engage in. The other one I'm kind of playing around with. So that's what I do in my personal writing time is I'll kind of work on those ideas and kind of fleshing them out a little bit more. But then I also, outside of work, love to do things that don't have anything to do with writing too. I love to bake and cook and do crafts and things like that. So I really like doing things that have nothing to do with my profession too, because it's a nice break. I mean, you need to switch it up.
Yeah.
For sure. And I guess as far as projects go, one thing that I'm working on right now is I'm refinishing our coffee table, which is not really something that I don't do furniture refinishing all that often, but it's a skill that I, want to learn more about. So I decided to give it a try. And, that has nothing to do with anything else in my life. It's a fun project to just kind of get lost in.
Yeah, I actually have 2 that I picked up at a thrift shop. They are beautiful lyre-back wooden tables.
Oh, wow.
Antique tables, but someone painted them with this awful blue.
Oh, that's always how it goes.
So I got them really cheap, but I have no idea how to do that. And I was like, Nathan, we're going to have to learn.
Yep. I used a lot of Google in this process.
Yeah, I relate for sure. So where can people find you online?
I am most active on Instagram, and that's at Andrea.Debbink, Debbink. And then I also have my own website where I have some of my work, a little bit of my portfolio is there, and that is AndreaDebbink.com. I'm also on Goodreads. I love making friends on Goodreads because I love getting to know other readers and finding out about good books. And I'm Andrea Debbink there too. I've kind of kept it simple. Same name across the board. Yeah, those are the 3 main places that I am.
And if people want to find your book,
it's called Spark, A Guide to Ignite the Creativity Inside You.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
So that's it for today's episode. I'll have links to Andrea's book and all of her websites on the show notes at kindlecuriosity.com, as well as a link to the giveaway, which is open through September the 2nd. A big thanks to all of my patrons who keep this podcast advert-free. If you want to support the podcast, you can pledge as little as $1 a month at kindlecuriosity.com. And if you want to support the podcast without pledging, you can subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcast. I'd love to hear what you think of today's episode on Instagram using hashtag Kindle Curiosity, or in our brand new Facebook group where we're talking all about curiosity and the creative process. See you there.